When we get started then, we have to talk about how we're going to approach the Bible. After all, if we want to understand it properly, we have to approach it properly. And so we want to talk about how we think about the Bible as we read it, how we come to understand what it has to say. Lots of times when Christians talk about reading the Bible, they talk about reading it literally. And that's an important concept. I think that when I try to express that for myself, I use all kinds of books and tools because I'm serious about the Bible and I want to read it seriously. For me, that means I want to read it for what it intended to say. Whatever it is that the author wanted to say, I'm going to take seriously. And I'm not going to try to edge around it or tap dance through it. I want to understand what the author was trying to communicate. So that's what we're going to focus on first. Hello, it's great to be here today to talk about something that's very important to me, and since you're all here, I assume something that's very important to you. We're going to talk about Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and to talk about how we can interpret the text so that we're sure that we're getting what we need to get from that text. It's an important text for lots of the things that are in conversation throughout the country and the world today as we think about science and the Bible. And that's where we want to start as we talk about science and the Bible and how we should think about those things. Anytime I talk about these issues, we have to start at the foundations. And that means we have to talk about authority. I believe very strongly in the authority of the biblical text, and in many of the audiences that I talk to, that's what's really important. And so authority is what we have to establish and how we go about finding out that which has authority in the biblical text. The first point to make is one that we understand that God has a purpose that he has to carry out in Scripture. How does he do that? Well, God chose to do it through human authors. Now, it could have been done other ways, but that's what God chose to do. And that means that God's purpose is being carried out through the human author's purpose. That's how the procedure worked. So that means that the authority of what God is communicating is vested in that human author. So that's what we want to try to understand. For that reason, we have to understand that the text is not written to us. That human author lived in a particular time period, in a particular cultural context, spoke a particular language. And the communication that he gave was a communication that was directed toward his audience, in his language, in his culture. So it was communicated to them, not to us. Now, having said that, of course, we also understand that the Bible is for us. The reason God did all of this was for his word to be communicated broadly to all people of all time. And so it's for us, but it's not to us. The message then transcends culture, but the form of it is culture bound. And that means that we have some work to do. What we need to do is try to take our place in the audience of that communicator, so that we can hear it the way that first audience heard it. Now that's got some very difficult issues for us to tackle because we don't know the language and we don't know the culture. But we have to try to read the text in that way. Now, as this author was communicating, and again, lots of times this is communicated orally before it was written down, but as that communication took place, we need to understand that there is integrity in the communication between the author and his first audience. What I mean by that is that the author knew what he was talking about, the speaker knew what he was talking about, and assumed that he was communicating effectively to the audience, and that therefore they could understand what he was talking about. It wasn't information that was way beyond them, that just sounded like gibberish or sounded mystical or something of that sort. It was meaningful, so there's some integrity to the communication. Now, that communication was taking place in what we call a high context. High context is where the speaker and the audience share a great deal of information. They understand things, and therefore there are things that don't need to be explained because there's a lot that is common ground for them. So a high context would be if you were in an upper level course and the professor didn't have to cover the basics anymore. He knows you know that stuff, and so communicating at the level at which you are. And if a beginner were to sit into that class, there's a lot of things they might not catch. That's high context. The speaker and the audience have much in common, and communication can assume a lot of background knowledge. Okay? The difference with that is low context. Low context is where the speaker and the audience have little common ground, and so a lot has to be explained. So if I teach material to a 6th grade class, there's a lot more I have to explain. I can't assume they know it. Okay? So what we have is that the speaker and his audience in the biblical context, they share a high context, and there are things they will not be explaining. We come in as a low context audience, and therefore there are things that we're not so clear about and that we have to try to come up to understand. We've got, again, some work to do. So when we start thinking about entering this world of the communicator and his audience, one of the first things we have to talk about is seeing the world the way the text saw the world. After all, they didn't have the perspective on the world around them that we have. We tend to think of a variety of things when we think about something like the moon or the sun. There are things that come to mind that's part of how we think about those things, about the world we live in, the globe we live on. And of course, they don't have those ideas. And so if we're going to enter that world of communication, we have to understand some of these things about the way they thought about the world. They're not addressing the world as everybody everywhere would understand it. They're talking about the world as they understand it. And God's communicating through that understanding. He's not giving them a new view of looking at it. So when we think about how they thought about the world, we have information from Egypt in texts, in reliefs, in tomb paintings, where they display how they think about the world. And it's a world that's heavily peopled with deities. So the sky is the sky god arched over the earth. The earth god is prone on the ground, and the air god is holding them apart. The sun god is sailing across the upper waters, and so it's heavily populated with deities. And in that way, they express what's most important to them about the world as they understand it. It's not so much the material shape of the world, it's rather the gods who are in charge of the world. And that's what they picture. So when they portray the cosmos as they understand it, that's what they're thinking about. Now, of course, for the Israelites, they don't have gods populating every aspect of the cosmos. They have one God who rules it all, who's in charge of it all. And so they don't think of a picture of the cosmos that's quite like that. But likewise, they're not thinking of a picture of the cosmos the way we do. They still have the idea of a solid sky, the pillars of the earth that hold it up, and who knows what those pillars rest on, waters below, waters above. Everybody in the ancient world believed there were waters above and waters below. If we're going to get the authority of the text, we have to see the world the way they're thinking about it. We can't impose our view of the world on the text, because then we're changing it. We're making something that wasn't. If the authority is in the human communicator to his initial audience, that's the meaning we have to work with. So Israel likewise had a different view of the cosmos than what we have. So whose cosmic geography counts? Whose view of the cosmos is most important? Well, again, if we want the authority of the text, we cannot provide our cosmic geography. Likewise, we cannot expect that God is going to embed in that message some private future cosmic geography to be seen when later audiences like us get there. He rather is going to communicate through the cosmic geography that they understand. So authority is tied into seeing the text for what it is in its communication. Okay, so as we think about authority, we also must understand that we have to see the text the way the Israelites saw the text. Again, that's where God's role is taking place, in that communication from the human author to the human audience. So how did they view the text? When we look at any passage of Scripture, we have to ask the question, how would the Israelite author and audience understand this text with what they knew? Now, it may be that God is using that communication to give them new information. He often does, about himself, about his role in the world, about people and who they are. Certainly, God is involved in giving them new information. But we have to try to understand what new information he does give and what new information he doesn't give. Okay, so we have to think of the text in their eyes and what they would understand. That's where authority takes place. Our goal is to be ethical readers. What does it mean to be an ethical reader? What we want to do as an ethical reader is to understand the text the way the author wanted to be understood, without trying to read anything into it and without trying to squeeze anything out of it. We want to read it as the author intended. We all know that if someone's today is making a speech and a newspaper reporter pulls out just one quote, a sound bite from that speech, and publishes it and then makes it seem like something else was being said, that's not ethical. And we can't do that with the Bible either. We have to read it in its context. So as ethical readers, we want to understand the text the way the author wanted to be understood. Okay, that means that we have to understand carefully the genre of the literature. Genre is the mode that's being used for communication. And so we better understand how that genre works and how it communicates. We have to understand the cultural perspective, because all communication takes place within a culture. And so we have to understand that aspect of the text. We need to also understand the focus of revelation. That is, there are incidentals in the communication of the text that are not the issue that's being revealed. Again, we're going to talk a little bit later about the idea that the biblical author is not revealing a new cosmic geography. He's talking about cosmic geography as they know it. And as a result, we don't see cosmic geography as the revelation that the text is giving. As ethical readers, we want to discern what is the focus of the revelation. All of this means that we can't make the text be what we want it to be. We can't demand that the text speak to us on our terms. We have to accept its terms. The author has chosen the conventions tied to the culture, tied to the genre, tied to the truth that that author wants to communicate. And so we can't take that and say, well, but wait a minute, we want to understand something else about origins. We want to know what the photograph would look like. We want to run the videotape of what the creation would have looked like. We have to be content with what the author has done. The author of Genesis 2 is not interested in giving the equivalent of a photo. And to that extent, we would have to say, you can't get there from here. We can't expect to reconstruct a scientifically sophisticated view of origins from a biblical text that is not trying to do that. It is their conventions that count. And that's where we're going to find the authority of the text, by tracking with their conventions.